The Nigel Farage Show.
Good morning, everybody. It's Boris Johnson. He's all over the news day after day after day. Some of it, of course, is about his personal life and the announcement that he's split from his wife of 25 years, Marina, and they are getting a divorce. Excellent cartoon, I thought, in the Daily Telegraph by Matt yesterday. Two people coming out of number 10, one saying to the other, if Mrs May was in charge of Boris's divorce, he'd end up staying married. I rather like that. So there's lots of personal stuff. There are photographs of Boris at the Oval yesterday, where England are on course to win this series 4-1 against India. And it's Boris sort of half asleep after lunch, and then pictures of Boris being shown on the screen from Sky, who were covering it, and he was getting a few boos and a bit of ribbing from the crowd. But today we are not going to talk about Boris's personal life. I don't think that's particularly relevant. There was indeed a Sky data poll done on this. Is Boris's divorce relevant to whether he should become the Prime Minister? 21% say yes, 72% say no. I would bet that almost everybody of that 21% would not be a Boris supporter anyway. I don't think that makes any difference in the modern world whatsoever, but if you disagree with me, please let me know. Now, it's politics I want to talk about, and it's his article. Boris has written today in the Mail on Sunday, and he's talking about Mrs May's Chequers deal, and he says, it's a humiliation. We look like a 7-stone weakling being comically bent out of shape by a 500-pound gorilla. We have opened ourselves up to perpetual political blackmail. We have wrapped a suicide vest around the British Constitution and handed a detonator to Michel Barnier. So it's that suicide vest comment. And, of course, people are basically saying he's accusing Mrs May of wrapping the country in a suicide vest. The question I want to debate this morning is, has he gone too far with these comments? Now, of course, we are used to Boris going quite a long way with comments. After all, he's a writer, he's a journalist, he's an author, and he's always, for all those long years he was working in Brussels and back in this country, he's always used flowery and colourful language. And, of course, it wasn't really very long ago when he was talking about the burqa, when he said, I could go further and say that it is absolutely ridiculous that people should choose to go around looking like letterboxes. So it's row after row after row with Boris. Is it just Boris being Boris? Or actually, has he gone too far? And has he damaged his chances? Well, before we came on air, we spoke to Harry Phibbs from Conservative Home, and we started off asking Harry what was his reaction to Boris's article in the Mail on Sunday that compares Mrs May's Chequers deal to that of Great Britain wearing a suicide vest and Brussels having the detonator.
Obviously, we expect Boris to be colourful and outspoken in the language that he uses, but in the article itself, I didn't think there was anything unreasonable. It wasn't. He was talking about the government's policy rather than personalising it in terms of Theresa May. So I think there's a bit of synthetic outrage. You know, it's a bit, as a bit there was in his previous article about the burqa, where people were saying he was wanting to ban the burqa, which actually wasn't the position that he advocated. But no, I think the language that he used about it being suicidal was reasonable, actually, that he was saying that we'd be in a position where the European Union would have the decision over the arrangements for Northern Ireland, and we wouldn't be able to, we wouldn't be in control of our own destiny. We wouldn't be in control of whether or not we were going to be forced back into the single market and the customs union and obeying EU rules, that they would be able to make the decision if they felt that trade wasn't frictionless enough with Northern Ireland. So I think it was a perfectly valid analogy for him to use.
So there we are, Harry Phibbs from Conservative Home talking about synthetic outrage over Boris's comments. Well, one person who is outraged is Sir Alan Duncan, who, interestingly, of course, was a junior minister when Boris was Foreign Secretary. They worked together. Alan Duncan tweeted overnight, for Boris to say that the PM's view is like that of a suicide bomber is too much. This marks one of the most disgusting moments in modern British politics. I'm sorry, but this is the political end of Boris. If it isn't now, I will make sure it is later. So we asked Harry Phibbs earlier, what did he make of Sir Alan Duncan's tweet?
Well, I thought that was extraordinary. First of all, I think he tweeted that last night, so I'm not sure that he'd actually read the article. So, that's in his defence in a way, that he might have been treating that out of ignorance. But it's an incredibly over-the-top, incredibly arrogant thing to say. Obviously, when the time comes to choose the next leader of the Conservative Party, that the Conservative MPs and then the Conservative members will make a decision. It won't be for Sir Alan Duncan to issue some sort of personal veto over the choice that's made. So no, that was absurd, his comment.
Well, recent polling by Conservative Home in August, who Harry Phibbs works for, and LBC's exclusive poll last Monday shows Boris is the front runner to lead the Tories, and in fact by quite some margin. I asked Harry how he felt about that.
Since he resigned over the Chequers deal, I mean, he's been free really to put forward the case for Brexit as he would see it, as a genuine Brexit where we become a self-governing nation. And before, I think he was rather constrained and in a sort of rather unhappy position as Foreign Secretary. And now he's sort of come out all guns blazing and being very powerful advocate for his beliefs. And I think that those resonate with the Conservative Party membership, and I think more broadly.
And finally, we asked, does he believe that Boris has the potential to become the Tory leader, and will, crucially, the Conservatives enable him to do this?
I think so. There is an important caveat that among the Conservative MPs, there's quite a bit of jealousy. You mentioned Sir Alan Duncan, which was I think was over the top, but there's certainly quite a lot of MPs who've got reservations, and the rules are that it's the top two candidates in a Tory leadership election who go through to the party membership, but the MPs are able to choose who gets into the top two. So in a way that might be a bigger hurdle than him winning among the Tory membership if he gets through to the final stage. So that would be that. I think that would be the tricky hurdle for him to manage. But I would think he would be in with a pretty good chance.
So that was Harry Phibbs, a Conservative Home, basically saying, look, what Boris said was perfectly reasonable, it's a question of context, and that actually he's really rather popular. Now, this LBC poll that was commissioned last Monday was a poll commissioned of leavers, regardless, of course, whether they were Tory voters, Labour voters, UKIP voters or non-voters. What that poll found was amongst leavers, 39% thought Boris was best placed to deliver a real Brexit, as opposed to 30% who felt the same for Theresa May. Look, my view is that Boris was very late to the Leave Party, really. I mean, for years and years and years, he'd made vaguely Eurosceptic comments, he'd written articles, but he'd always basically said we should stay part of it and try and reform it, and he came to the Leave campaign late. He was a very important voice in that referendum campaign, and my biggest criticism of him over the years is it's been often difficult to work out what he exactly believes in, what he exactly stands for. I think it's clear that he now does absolutely believe in Brexit, and I think, colourful language it may be, but actually, given this backstop arrangement, given Chequers, actually, we would be giving, if we signed up to this Chequers deal, we'd be giving Monsieur Barnier total power to regulate every aspect of our economic life without us even having a say. It would be a complete betrayal, not just of the Brexit vote, but actually of our national interest. I think he is wholly justified in saying these things. Others, like Sir Alan Duncan, think he's gone over the top and this is the end of him. What do you think? That's what matters, really. Let's go to Chris in South Croydon. Good morning, Chris.
Oh, good morning, Nigel. Well, the problem as I see it is we've got a Prime Minister who approaches the Brexit issue like a vegetarian who's just been served up a plate of steak tartare. I mean, her heart isn't in it. But don't forget, even Barnier's rejected the Chequers deal. There's no chance of that going through.
Well...
and I'd like to see Boris use his undoubted elegance and gift for use of language. That's because he's got a proper degree instead of PPE, like all these other idiot politicians. In pointing out the real danger is a fudge. we could end up with something similar to Chequers, but as you say, leaving us virtually just the same as we are now.
Yeah, actually, in some ways, Chris, what Mrs May's trying to line us up for with Chequers is rather worse, I think, than where we are at the moment.
Yes.
I mean, actually, what we did see, Chris, towards the end of last week was some warmer words coming out of Barnier, coming out of Brussels about Chequers. To me, the mystery, Chris, is for nearly 20 years, leading EU figures have said to me, if you want to leave and have a simple free trade deal, that's fine with us. But the problem is Mrs May wants more than a simple free trade deal. She wants to keep us very closely tied to all sorts of regulatory agencies, etc. Chris, do you think do you think he's now the man to take control of this, or do you think these comments damage him?
No, I don't think they do, but I do think I am worried about him as a certain moral emptiness in him, which other people have commented on. But on the other hand, that does not stop him from being an extremely effective Prime Minister. Yeah,
I mean, the big criticism of him from those that worked with him during his years of journalism is that, frankly, he would just make things up and believe he could get away with it.
Yes.
And there is some evidence of that, and perhaps that's what you're referring to. Mm-hmm. But he does have personality, I would put to you, Chris. And also, I think, when you're doing something, when you're going into a big change, which Brexit is, we need somebody with optimism, and I think Boris has that quality.
Oh yes, but also, of course, the other thing I had to comment on is how anybody can doubt Brexit after seeing how utterly repulsive the EU people are. Barnier, tell you what he reminds me of, is Gromyko, isn't he? He's like the foreign minister of Russia during the Cold War.
Yes, and actually...
He was smiling or laughing. Has he ever laughed at anything in his life?
No, I don't think so. Never in my company, Chris, in the coffee room, and I should be seeing him this week. No, he doesn't smile very much. And your reference to the Soviet Union, Brezhnev, of course, had this doctrine of limited sovereignty, which is rather what they're applying to Poland and Hungary and others today. Chris, very good call. Thank you. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show, exclusively on LBC, and it's now 10:15. Well, the polls are open in Sweden. Their general election takes place today. Is it going to be another big leap forward for the populist revolt? We'll examine that in a few minutes. But back to Boris. His comments. He says that we've wrapped a suicide vest around the British Constitution and handed the detonator to Michel Barnier. Has he gone too far? Has he gone over the top? And as that's going on, the Sunday Times today reveal the Boris Dirty Dossier, produced by people, aides to Mrs May, in case of the event of a direct Boris leadership challenge. All sorts of details about Boris's life in journalism, Boris's personal life. The Dirty Tricks Department are ready for a Boris run. Isn't politics just such a charming business to be in? Well done, Boris. Well done on speaking plainly and saying as it is. This is leadership. Boris Johnson, the Gordon Ramsay of UK politics, says Chris. Because he did use the F word about big business, didn't he? So I guess that was quite Gordon Ramsay-ish in a way. Nigel, Boris's comment was flippant, but was used to highlight how much damage could unfold if Brexit isn't handled properly. I think all politicians should have the right to speak freely, their mind and opinions, and let us know exactly what they stand for. When I look at lots of Labour and Lib Dems, they seem to be too far engineered in their views and opinions and attitudes they express. Thanks for keeping it real, says Nigel. There we are, Boris. You've got one or two fans out there, even if Sir Alan Duncan isn't one of them. I just remind everybody of what Alan Duncan put out last night. He said, for Boris to say that the PM's view is like that of a suicide bomber is too much. This marks one of the most disgusting moments in modern British politics. I'm sorry, but this is the political end of Boris Johnson. If it isn't now, I will make sure it is later. Sir Alan, I know you're a Remainer. I know you hate the whole Brexit thing, but isn't that really... I mean, to say that this is one of the most disgusting moments in modern British politics, he didn't even direct those comments directly at her personally. He made a general point about the Chequers deal. Alan Duncan, that is completely over the top in my view. Let's go to South London, to Streatham, and speak to Robbie. Good morning, Robbie.
Good morning, Nigel. How are you? All right?
Yeah, I'm well. I'm back in the UK after a week in Oz, where actually their Conservative Party, which are called the Liberals, they are completely all over the shop with internecine warfare. They've been through 7 prime ministers in 11 years in Australia. But things aren't much better here. The difference is, Robbie, that Australia, the economy's doing well, the country's in great shape, and we're facing Brexit, a very, very big job that needs to be signed and sealed and acted on by the end of March. We're not in a great place, are we?
Well, no, we're not, actually, and I haven't studied British Constitution, but it wasn't until Gina Miller challenged through judicial review the fact that this country is run on parliamentary decisions. And not many people in Britain, I think, have studied British Constitution. And I'm wondering whether Boris Johnson would be making the comments he made now, these inflammatory comments, were it not for the fact that the whole issue from the beginning was done back to front, and why all the MEPs, all the MPs, and that includes yourself, Nigel, didn't force David Cameron to go down the right route to have a debate in Parliament before the referendum was called.
Well,
and then when the referendum
Robbie, hang on. There was a debate in Parliament and a vote on Parliament as to whether the referendum should proceed, and it received an overwhelming majority. So
that was the referendum, but the thing is, there was no debate as to what the parliamentary decision would be, and whether they wanted to leave or remain. Well, now the whole point is that if it was a resounding remain from Parliament, the people should have been informed that Parliament have the right to veto any decision that the public make. But if not, then Parliament would go ahead with the public referendum.
Constitutionally, Robbie, everything you say is, of course, absolutely right. However, a national referendum is a time when we do not go through the usual route of representative democracy, and this is important. That £9 million document that Mr. Cameron sent to every one of our households said within it explicitly, the decision is yours and we will implement it. And surely that overrides our normal constitutional process, because this was a one-off situation.
Well, I mean, were there not objections from other members within Parliament that weren't in favour of that? Did they not criticise David Cameron saying that, and wasn't there no articles in the newspapers?
Well, I think, to be honest, Robbie, if on the verge of a national referendum on a matter of this importance, MPs had stood up and said, "We don't care what you vote; it'll be our say anyway," they wouldn't dare to say that, would they? Because there would have been a huge public reaction against them. So no, voices on that were very, very muted indeed. Robbie, I get your point constitutionally, but what about morally? Isn't it morally the case that government and Parliament should carry out the express will of the people?
I think it should be, but on the basis of the fact that they go down the right route and carry out the right debates, and make it quite plain to the people. And then following that, Nigel, when it came to a decision before that referendum was even taken, the European Union members should have been approached to get a definitive answer to what it was going to cost us to leave the European Union, so that people would have known in advance what they were voting for, what deal they were voting for. Well,
I'm not sure it really costs us anything to leave the European Union, Robbie. It's just a question of what we're prepared to give. But let's say, Robbie, I mean, we've got these negotiations. We're all over the place. We don't really know exactly where Theresa May's taking us. She appears to want us to be half in and half out. Would Boris make a better job of it?
Personally, if Boris Johnson were the last MP on earth and leader, I would not vote for him. He's a bully boy. He's non-diplomatic. He's not very good at diplomacy at all. He can upset a lot of people, and moreover, he does not listen to the little people. He's very dismissive.
But Robbie,
what he says goes.
But Robbie, he did manage to, win elections to be Mayor of London in a city that is pretty much a Labour city these days. He does have electoral appeal, Robbie.
When he did, what I'm amazed about is why he had the bikes made in Canada when Britain was going through a period of austerity, when there were plenty of British engineers over here to make the bikes.
No, there are all sorts of criticisms anyone can have of any Mayor of London at any time, but he does have personality, he does attract votes. I mean, isn't he, compared to all the really rather boring, dull people, doesn't he bring a little bit of fun to it, Robbie?
Well, he might well bring a bit of fun, but if he's leading us down the wrong road, I don't think it's the right person to fill the position, to be quite honest with you.
OK, so you feel, Robbie, strongly that the Constitution should be upheld and that ultimately Parliament's got to sort Brexit out, not the people's decision on June 23rd, 2016.
Well, no. I basically think that the people should have a great say in it. I think, well, let's put it this way. We're in a bit of a cleft stick here, really, because of the way it's been handled. The Parliament does have to get on with it. Whoever does it, and I don't relish Theresa May's, and I don't support Theresa May, incidentally, in any great way, but I wouldn't relish any MP doing that job because they're not going to win with the people.
No,
it's going to win with the people.
It's not easy, Robbie. No one said it was. Thank you very much indeed for your call, and Robbie, they're not a great fan of Boris. I wonder whether these repeated comments that are portrayed as being outrageous, I wonder whether they are perhaps damaging slightly his support in the country. I don't know. I mean, essentially the other evening we had a phone in about Boris. There wasn't quite as much enthusiasm for Boris as I thought there might be. Edward from Sunderland says, interesting that there was nowhere near this much outrage when Remain campaigners were using similarly shocking language to describe the prospect of leaving the EU. Edward, they promised us everything short of plagues of black locusts descending upon our islands. Nigel, Sir Alan who? Never heard of him. Another political non-entity, says Laura from Shenfield and Essex. Sir Alan is very, very important. It must be addressed as Sir Alan at all times. On Twitter, I get the real suicide is leaving the EU, deal or no deal. Not for those of us, matey, that want to govern our own country. We actually view it as being a wonderful, invigorating prospect. Ross is calling from Bromley. Good morning, Ross.
Good morning, Nigel. Well, before I start, can I just submit to you that perhaps Sir Alan was somewhat inebriated when he made those comments on Twitter.
What a terrible thing to say. Because you do know, Ross, that you can, in the House of Commons, you can pretty much call another member whatever you like. You can call them philanderers and wrong-uns, but if you accuse another member of being drunk, that is against the rules. There was the famous time when the late Alan Clark, and he was dressed in black tie. He was at a dinner, and he was dragged back to the Commons to give a ministerial statement, having not expected it. And he could basically hardly speak, and he was absolutely cut. And Claire Shaw got up and said he was drunk, and she had to apologise. So, Ross, you must not say Sir Alan was inebriated. You may say maybe he was tired and emotional.
Yes, of course. Well, maybe that's better. Well, maybe it would go along with the whole idea of adding to liveliness our public discourse if we had more inebriated politicians like Sir Alan, and also if we had Boris jump into the fray. Look, I don't agree with Brexit, but it's been voted on now. It's passed. So maybe we should just have Boris have a go at it.
Okay, do you think, Ross, whatever Boris's flaws, and clearly they're many, but equally he's got some great talents too, do you think, Ross, and you're not a Brexiteer, but we're going through this process, do you think he would make a better job of it and make the country feel a bit happier if he was in charge and not Mrs May?
Yeah, I do. Well, definitely Theresa May, and that's the thing is you really only have these two options, it seems. And yeah, I do. I think he would... Okay. Make it better, yeah. Yeah, well, I have to say, Ross, I agree with that, absolutely. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC, and it's now 10:30. And Sweden goes to the polls today. Sweden, a country that had very settled politics for a long period of time, a country in which, with relatively high taxes and quite a big state, many talked about the Swedish model, perhaps the one country in which a form of socialism had seemed to be a very great success. But that settled politics has radically changed over the course of the last few years. To help us through this, to explain where we are with Swedish politics and what might happen today is, and I'm very bad at these pronunciations, but it's Tova Svenoni, I think is right. Is that right, Tova?
That was very good, actually.
Oh, well, that was more by luck than judgment, believe me. Head of National News at Swedish Radio ERCOT. Good morning. Tova, please explain, because we've never really looked much at Sweden politically, because it's been so settled over the years. Just explain to begin with.
It's been so stable, it's been boring, right?
Well, in many ways boring, but I used to do business and go to Stockholm regularly, and I remember thinking, this is one of the most contented countries on earth. Everything seemed to work very well, and things have changed. Explain to the listeners who the main parties are today in Swedish politics.
Right, we have 8 parties in Parliament now, and they form 2 sides traditionally, one left side and one right side. And that's the traditional way that Swedish politics have been divided. So after every election, traditionally, there has been you have to look at which side is the biggest and which side can form a majority in the Parliament, and that side forms the government. So it's been quite easy. But then the Sweden Democrats showed up, and they have grown over the last years. And now they are a big third factor in Swedish politics. And that has changed the game plan totally in the Swedish Parliament and made it more difficult to govern because it's harder to form a majority in Parliament.
Yeah, but
the 2 sides...
They sit in the European Parliament now, and I think they first got into the Swedish Parliament in 2010, if I'm right.
Yeah, that's right.
And it would be fair to say, would it not, completely objectively, that if you go back to the 1980s, their roots as a political party genuinely were on the extreme right?
Yeah, that's right.
And they've tried to rebrand. Under their leader, Jimmy Åkesson, they would say that they've left their far-right past behind them. They've reformed. They're very tough on immigration, and pro rata, Sweden's had more migrants go to it than any other European country. Have they succeeded in the eyes of Swedish media and elsewhere? Have they managed to detoxify themselves from their history?
I think partly, yes. And especially when it comes to the voters, because they are growing. And in the last election, they had 13% of the voters, and now it looks like they can be the second biggest party in Sweden, or the third. But it's a real possibility that they might be the second biggest party.
Yeah, I was looking at polls saying they're on 20% of the vote, and yet tough on immigration, and Jimmy Åkesson promising that if he gets the chance, a referendum for Swedes on Sweden's EU membership.
Yes. So they are tough on immigration and also very negative to the EU.
Yeah, okay.
So that's important issues for them.
And has this new input of them, and as you say, they're lying second in the polls at the moment, who's to say what will happen on the day, does it mean that there's a bigger interest in Swedish politics? Does this mean turnout goes up?
It might, but it's hard to tell because the turnout is usually quite good in Sweden. So it's hard to tell if the turnout will be better than normal, but it might be.
And if they were...
And it's also that the Sweden Democrats may have voters that normally wouldn't vote. We don't know that.
And equally, they may have voters who are too shy to tell pollsters, because we had this with Brexit, we saw it with Trump. They're almost scared to admit that they're going to vote for parties like this. If they did, and I'm not saying they will, but if they did become the biggest party in Sweden today, would the other parties consider forming a coalition with them, or will they be left out in the cold?
The thing is, no one wants to talk to them. So even if they would be the biggest party, that's not likely, but we don't know. Everything can happen.
Yes.
I don't think it's possible right now for them to be in a government because no one wants to cooperate with them. On the other hand, it's hard for the other parties to, if they would to be the biggest party, it's hard for the other parties not to talk to them because they have a big base of people.
And one thing I've noticed, I do follow Swedish politics. One thing I've noticed is that the other parties, to some extent, have tried to take some of the Swedish Democrats' rhetoric, because there is now talk, is there not, in the other parties of reducing the numbers coming into Sweden.
Yes, almost all parties are now talking about immigration in a different way than they did 4 years ago, or a very different way as they did 8 years ago. So they have affected Swedish politics.
So is populism now sweeping Sweden?
I wouldn't say that, but you could.
OK, thank you very much indeed, Tova. That was great. Well, that gives you a bit of a rundown on where we are with what was very boring politics in Sweden. The Swedish Democrats lying second in the polls at the moment, tough on immigration, anti-EU, and already as we saw there, the other parties now beginning to change their rhetoric. Sweden, over the course of the last few years, a country of 10 million people, and about 600,000 of those have been migrants that have come within the last decade. Pro rata, they've taken more than any other country. And you'll have seen in the last few weeks, the scenes of cars burning in city centres, huge increases in murder rates, huge increases in sexual violence. That's not to say that all of that is being done by migrants coming in, a majority of it is, but a general breakdown of law and order in Sweden cities, a place in which that would have been literally unthinkable 20 years ago. Back to Boris. Has he gone too far? Is talking about us being put into a national suicide vest and handing a detonator to Monsieur Barnier, is it over the top? Does he start to lose credibility? Or actually, is it about time someone just told it as it is and put a direct challenge to Mrs May? Harry is a new caller from Bournemouth. Good morning, Harry.
Good morning to you, Nigel.
So, what do you make of Boris's words?
I think he's absolutely correct, and I completely and utterly support what he is saying. If we go down this route that Mrs May wants us to go down, we may as well have just completely and utterly changed taken away all of our vetoes and all of our power that we currently have. We're going to end up in a worse position than what we were before we all voted. And I think it's absolutely correct that Boris is standing up for what the people said. And the vote was in or out, and that is what we need, not to become, as a lot of people are calling it, a vassal state.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that, Harry. Of course I agree with that. But let me ask you about Boris. Does it worry you that he continually gets into a row, whether it's talking about, people wearing burqas looking like letterboxes, whether it's the use of this term suicide vest, whether it's his continually, it would appear, colourful private life? Does any of this stuff worry you about Boris?
No, not at all. I think it's very refreshing that we've got a politician and a potential leader that actually is willing to speak his mind rather than pussyfoot around everything. With regards to his love life, well, good, that's a personal thing, and it doesn't affect him becoming, possibly becoming a Prime Minister in my eyes. I actually think that he would be a great man as Prime Minister.
And he's not very,
there's a
he's not very diplomatic, Harry, is he?
Well, nor was Winston Churchill, and he became probably the best Prime Minister this country's ever had.
Is Boris the British Trump?
Yes.
OK. All right, Harry, that was very interesting. Thank you. And actually, the more you start to put this together, the more he does look a bit like the British Trump, doesn't he? Interesting. Peter is calling from Wimbledon. Peter, good morning to you.
Good morning to you, Nigel. Before I get to Boris, one thing I'd like to say to you and to your loyal followers, that out of all people who voted in a referendum, Brexit referendum, only people on the Remain side knew what they were voting for.
No, they didn't. No. Peter, stop. The European Union does not stay where it is. It is a process aiming at never-ending integration. And and I'm saying this, Peter, because I'm going to be sitting next to, on Wednesday morning this week, sitting next to, in Strasbourg, the European Commission, and Mr Juncker will give his State of the Union address. Last year he told us that the European army would be completed by 2025. That wasn't put to the electorate during the referendum. So the idea that Remain is just a still static status quo is simply not true.
Well, it is true because we have the right of veto for a start. And the other thing is about the army, what you go so upset about is your pal across the pond, Mr. Trump, has already said that NATO is obsolete, and European nations have to take care of their own defences themselves. And that's why European Union is rightly so talking about creating its own military. And the thing is that what is the difference between NATO and EU forces? We only have a difference is that there is no US in it.
This is about the truth. This is about the truth. Look, I debated this in 2014 with Nick Clegg. I said one of the reasons not to be part of the EU is it's developing a European army. I don't think we should be a part of it. Clegg described that as a dangerous fantasy. And on your point about veto, we have no vetoes over changes to legislation that affect our business life in this country. The European Union, I repeat, is a process aiming towards never-ending integration, aiming towards a unitary state. So I reject totally this idea that Remain was a static state. But Peter, let's move on. Let's move on.
Let's move on because there's such a variety of issues, and you guys, yourself, including Boris Johnson, you lied about so many things.
Peter, I've had 50 years of lies, 50 years of being told it's just about trade. Don't worry your stupid little heads. Let me ask you, Peter, quickly. I know you've called before and we don't agree on this, and that's fine. It's what LBC's for in many ways. But in your view, forgetting where you stand on Brexit, as a person, do you think Boris's comments are over the top, or do you think actually they're appropriate?
Well, this is why I called you, because I'm really annoyed, because people like you are laughing at it and you're making jokes and stuff. What you don't realise, that the comments like Boris Johnson made, they are deeply, deeply upsetting to the family and the loved ones who lost their loved ones in suicide bombings which happened in this country. And when you make comparison of our Prime Minister to someone wearing a suicide vest, you clearly have lost your moral compass completely.
All right.
And if you think that that's my opinion. That's what
No, Peter, listen, I've got to move on. You've given your opinion clearly, and Peter thinks it's wholly inappropriate to say that. It's an insult to the loved ones of people who've been killed by suicide bombers. It's not an unreasonable point. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show. It is now 10:46. It's wall-to-wall Boris. It's Boris falling asleep watching the cricket and being booed by the crowd. It's Boris Johnson's personal life. It's the dirty dossier on Boris that Number 10 has produced if he makes a real direct public run against Mrs May. But of course, above all, it's his article in the Mail on Sunday where he says we have opened ourselves to perpetual political blackmail. We have wrapped a suicide vest around the British Constitution and handed a detonator to Michel Barnier. Are those comments over the top, or is it just kind of what you expect from Boris and accepting the point that anybody who has lost somebody as a result of a suicide bombing might feel offended by those comments? In general terms, I would say the thing I like about Boris, there are things I don't like, the thing I like about Boris is he makes people smile. There's a little bit of optimism. When he talks about Brexit, he talks about the sunlit uplands in the years to come that we'll have as an independent nation. It's all a lot better than the perpetual misery we get from Mrs May. That's my view. Daniel is a new caller from Marylebone. Good morning, Daniel.
Hey, good morning, Nigel. How are you?
Good morning. I'm well. So, has Boris got this right, or has he got it wrong?
For someone as well-read and well-spoken as Boris, he's used a poor choice of words, but let's not detract from the point. And why we're even having this phone call on your show today, I'm surprised. I'd expect this on maybe James May's show. But the point is, he called a spade with a poor choice of words. And for someone like Peter to take offence, rather than actually focus on the issues here of capitulation and us bending over to Europe, we're all getting lost in the fuzz and the spin of it all.
So is Daniel your point that what Boris is saying is correct in terms of direction of travel, but a distraction in terms of the words he's used?
Absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Okay. Yeah, okay. I do understand that. But this is Boris, Daniel, isn't it? And you're right. He's highly educated, and you can sit down and talk about the classics with him. And he's written some in his book on Churchill. I'd recommend anybody to read. It's a terrific read.
But I think look at Peter's point as a Remainer here. He's taken this as a personal insult almost of what Boris has used as language. He's not focused on debate and educated, informed discussion around Brexit. He only wants to get touchy-feely and oversensitive. And this is the problem the Remain side have. They can't sit down and ever produce any tangible debate. They can get wound up, they can get upset, but they can't retort on Brexit.
What do you think? What do you think Boris should have said? I mean, should Boris have said that Mrs May's deal is a betrayal of the Brexit vote and would lead to us being disadvantaged by future EU decisions?
He has come out on the record and said that multiple times.
Yes.
Simply by resigning over Chequers, he's put his job on hold as a result of that. So I don't think he needs to state that anymore.
So is he Daniel? I mean, come on, we are dealing here with an intelligent person. Is he changing the rhetoric? Is he upping it because he wants to keep in the front pages?
I think he's seen around the world, people are now appreciating being spoken to as human beings, not as electoral voters, but as human beings per se. And that, using real language that's used by the man in the pub, the man on the street, the woman on the street, the man, the lady in the pub, is actually now appreciated. And it's, it's a result of your work and other people's work over the years that we are tired of being spoken to, and everything is window dressed and decorated for our benefit. Let's call a spade now, and it's refreshing, as one caller said earlier, to hear Boris talk like a real human being.
Okay.
And figure it how it is, not sugarcoat it, but say, it is what it is, and we need to...
and if we have this conversation, Daniel, if you and I have this conversation in 2 or 3 months' time on this show, do you think by then he could be Prime Minister?
I very much hope he will be Prime Minister. I would prefer Jacob Rees-Mogg to be Prime Minister, in truth, because I think he would be he's a more educated, slightly more refined version of Boris even. Well,
there's a point about Jacob. There's a point about Jacob. I mean, Richard from Salford says this to me on text. The sooner Johnson is Prime Minister, the better. As much as I'd like to see Jacob Rees-Mogg at the helm, I think it might be a bit too early for him, but his time will come. Would you agree with that?
I think he was born ready. He's been ready since the age of 7 years of age. And if you go back and you watch videos on him talking as a young kid, he was destined for this position in life. And I look forward to seeing him there one day, please God.
Well, in many ways, so do I. Daniel, I thank you very much indeed for your call. Interesting that we didn't get this outrage during the campaign when Remainers told us shocking things would happen to us. Yes, I know. David is in Wimbledon. David, good morning.
Good morning, Nigel. How are you?
I am well. Now, Boris, is he over the top? Is he damaging himself? Well, keep making the headlines, saying things that are outrageous, or is it synthetic outrage we're hearing from Sir Alan Duncan and others?
Well, I think we only just have to look 3,500 miles across the Atlantic and the election of Donald Trump.
Yep.
And I think that Donald Trump was elected because he spoke directly to the people in language that they understand. And they don't, and never sugarcoated it. And I think the problem is that there are too many people who just cannot accept, the use of language. I think Boris knew exactly what the words that he was using.
Yeah.
And I think that, it was a metaphor, and I think it was perhaps unfortunate for some people who were affected. I'm an ex-military guy. My regiment served in Afghanistan, Iraq. I have former colleagues of mine, that unfortunately lost limbs as a result of that action. But I don't think that they would condemn Boris for what he has said. I think the metaphor was entirely appropriate.
Yeah, and I get your point, David, about Trump, etc. I think we've had enough. We're bored with these careerist politicians who never say boo to a goose, who are politically correct beyond belief. We want real people, flaws and all, that stand up and say stuff and mean it, don't we?
Well, I think you're absolutely right. And I think, actually, if you look at politics in general, I think the dissatisfaction of the British people with our politicians is that the politicians are ranked the lowest. Have the lowest regard and respect amongst the British people, below that of a car salesman. I think it's down to
or an estate agent, or
yeah. At 14%, and I think it's because people think that they talk. They're double standards. They say one thing. And they do.
I think, David.
Different.
Yeah,
and I think
it's self-interest, isn't it? We think they're in it for themselves, they're in it for the career, and they'll say anything to get elected. Isn't that what it's really all about?
Well, I think that's a shame, and I think that is why we're seeing politics turned on its head in other countries. What we're seeing in sort of Sweden, what we've seen in Italy, what we've seen in the United States, around the world, is that people want to be spoken to and told things how they are.
Yeah.
You are always going to cause some offence. Like Peter in Wimbledon, who's a scratch record when it comes around to Brexit. I've heard him many times.
Yeah, he's a regular caller.
Thinking that us Remainers were stupid and we didn't know what we voted for.
I know. I must admit, and also his argument, David, that Remain was a status quo when it's not, it's a process. David, I've got to let you go there. 2 last quick comments on this. Scott says on Facebook, the only thing Boris can be trusted with is his own self-interest. Bob says, if Boris becomes PM, we really would be the laughing stock of the world. Well, as ever, anything to do with Boris gives us a huge amount of opinion on both sides. He knew what he was writing here. I don't think it's offensive. I think Sir Alan and others are using this as an excuse. It is, as ever, faux outrage. Right, now, talking of personalities, President Trump has always said that dark forces and the deep state were out to get him. Now, after revelations of a resistance within the White House, does the president have a point? If you think, no, Trump's paranoid, then call me on 0345 6060 973. Or maybe you think the officials really are working against him, in which case text to 84850. Or maybe you think it's just politics as usual, in which case tweet using the hashtag Farage and LBC at LBC. And of course, you can watch us live on Facebook and you can comment there too. Is Trump right when he says there are dark forces out to get him? It's beginning to look like it. All through the election campaign, Donald Trump said he was going to drain the swamp. And he then said, since he's become president, he's talked time and again about there being dark forces, the deep state, as it's called, that are out to get him and want to stop him putting in place his agenda. There are some similar arguments that get made in this country, that there's a deep state at work inside Whitehall that wants to water Brexit down, that wants to push May in a direction where Brexit doesn't really mean Brexit. Now, very often you see this stuff and you think, wow, this is just loopy conspiracy theory. This is just crackers. But something happened last week that was really, really interesting. There was this anonymous article that appeared in the New York Times purporting to come from a senior official inside the administration saying that there are a group of people there in the West Wing and within those boundaries, that he says, we have vowed to do what we can to preserve our democratic institutions whilst thwarting Mr. Trump's more misguided impulses until he's out of office. So what they're saying is there's a group of them there trying to stop Trump putting into place his agenda. I would emphasise the agenda upon which he was elected. Now, there's been a huge witch hunt going on to try and find out who wrote the article, and denials coming from several. This was Trump's reaction to the New York Times article this week.
We have somebody in what I call the failing New York Times that's talking about he's part of the resistance within the Trump administration. This is what we have to deal with. And, you know, the dishonest media, because you people deal with it as well as I do.
So that's Trump talking about, and using that term, resistance. People are working for the government, and yet they're trying to stop the government doing what it's supposed to be doing. It begins to make you think that actually this idea that there is a deep state isn't some crackpot conspiracy theory. This is what Vice President Pence had to say on the matter.
I think it's a disgrace. The anonymous editorial published in the New York Times represents a new low in American journalism. And I think the New York Times should be ashamed. And I think whoever wrote this anonymous editorial should also be ashamed as well.
So really interesting. And today, John Sopel, again in the Mail on Sunday, but John Sopel today, of course, and he, of course, is the BBC's America correspondent. Famously, if you remember, there was the press conference when Sopel got up to ask a question and the president, knowing full well who John Sopel was, of course, the president said, "Excuse me, can you please identify which media organisation you're from?" And John Sopel says, "I have the honour to represent the BBC." And Trump says, "Oh yeah, that's another beauty, isn't it?" So he was basically accusing the BBC, along with CNN and others, as being fake news. But John Sopel, I've known John Sopel many, many years, and he is a very, very perceptive and good journalist. And he talks today under a headline, "Trump's enemies are proving his conspiracy theories true." And he says, so what legitimacy does the writer have in declaring that he or she is the guardian of US democracy? For better or worse, the ballot box is where elections are decided, and in November 2016, the American people spoke. If you're unhappy about the administration's direction of travel, you have the choice of resigning and fighting the Trump agenda at the next election. And John Sopel is absolutely right, because there's almost nothing that Trump has done that he didn't promise he would do during that election campaign. He said, I'm going to do all these things. That's exactly what he's trying to do. And now he's being resisted from within the White House. Trump's enemies are proving his conspiracy theories true. And I wonder, added on to that, whether this could be said to be true of this country as well. Because isn't it interesting that David Davis produces a white paper as to how we're going to handle Brexit, to be told by the Prime Minister, well, that's very good of you, David, but we don't actually need that because our civil servant here, Ollie Robbins, has produced something that's much more to my liking. Is the whole of Whitehall working to undermine the government and the manifesto upon which they were elected? Is there a deep state at work? I wonder what Pat in Stepney Green makes of that. Good morning.
Oh, good morning. Yeah, look, I mean, it was apparent as soon as Donald Trump got the gig that people would be against him because they all wanted Hillary the witch Clinton.
The witch? You called her the... Why are you so disparaging about the lovely Hillary?
Well, she seems an hard-nosed bee. You know, she seems an hard-nosed.
All right, fair enough. No, listen, Pat, she hates me. I was being a bit sarcastic. She said some very nasty things about me. So, all right. So, Pat, so you think this is... So, when Trump talks about the dark forces working against him, you believe there is some truth in this, yeah?
Well, I mean, it's like Brexit. I mean, there's dark forces working against that. And also, there's dark forces working against the Russian state because Putin would not join the European project. He didn't want nothing to do with the liberal West. So they're all ganging up on him as well.
How do we change this, Pat? Because we've had, we've voted for Brexit, we've voted for Trump, we've voted for fundamental changes in both cases, and it's proving a bit harder to get there, isn't it?
Yeah, because these people are so wealthy and so much power, and they're like a cabal of American, European, globalists that they want a one world order.
Yeah, and some would say the Bilderbergers. I've no doubt. Pat, thank you, and Pat thinks it is true. I think a growing number of people feel that there are some quite dark forces at work that don't necessarily like the way we vote in elections. John is calling from Formby, a regular caller to this show. Good morning, John.
Yes, good morning, Nigel.
So is Trump right to say there are dark forces against him?
Oh, absolutely. I think the root of the problem is that the cosy establishment has had it too good for too long. They see their entire way of life being threatened, and they're employing sabotage tactics. They want people within the government and the media to give Trump a rocky ride. They want him to fail, and they're doing everything they can to achieve that.
Do you see a parallel, John, here with Brexit?
Oh, absolutely. It's the same thing. It's like a football match where your team's losing 1-0, you score a valid equaliser, and the bent referee says it's not going to 1-1.
Yeah, I mean, I have to say, I'm just enraged at the role the civil service have played through the whole Brexit negotiations here. And I remember, John, little anecdote for you. I remember going into the West Wing to see Steve Bannon, and he was there in his office, and, he was the president's key advisor, and I was having a conversation with him, and kind of noticed that he was kind of talking back to me in very whispered tones, and Steve just assumed that everything he said and did was being listened to by the security services in the USA. So he was absolutely convinced that there was a deep state there that was out to damage the president. The question is, whether it's in America, John, or whether it's here, how do we stop the deep state from acting against the democratically expressed will of the people? What do we do about it?
Oh, that's a very good question. We need more whistleblowers for a start.
Yeah.
And the whole culture has to be changed.
It's a heck of a job, isn't it? Draining the swamp or completely changing the way Whitehall operates. So it's a heck of a job, isn't it?
It is, yes. But I think it can be done. You've got to have very clear rules, and people have got to stick to them, and there's got to be compliance by the establishment. They're very good at imposing compliance on us. Well, it's high time we impose it on them.
Not easy. John, I thank you, and I have to say, to me, the big difficulty is just how do we deal with this? John is calling from Glasgow. Good morning, John.
Morning, Nigel. There has always been a deep state. Anybody who's ever watched Yes Minister will realise that.
Yeah, that's a good point. That it just sort of reminds me what a fantastic programme that was, wasn't it?
It was indeed, and the civil service in this country haven't necessarily changed. It's all about how how clever or how skillful the politician is at getting the civil servant to actually implement and do what he actually wants. Because I seem to recall the civil servant, I think it was Nigel Hawthorne, spent a great deal of time trying to thwart what Jim Harker wanted to do.
Yes. Now, there was the wonderful episode in which they decided to cut back civil service numbers, and by the time they'd finished the exercise, there were actually more of them, I remember.
Well, Nigel Hawthorne, as well, as far as Donald Trump being perhaps, shall we say, unstable or mad, there's nothing new in that either, because I seem to recall this country had a mad head of state in the form of King George III. And it didn't prevent this country from being hugely successful, because I seem to recall, even though we had a mad head of state, we defeated Napoleon, we won Trafalgar, and we won the battle at Waterloo.
And we founded Australia, but at the same time we lost the American colonies. No,
well, that's right. Yeah, this might be the chance to get the colonies back.
Well, I hadn't really expected the phone call to go quite in that direction, John. But how do we stop this, John? I mean, we're supposed to live in democracies. We, the people, are supposed to empower governments on a manifesto. And if we find that actually it is the state employees that think, oh, no, we can't have this. This is not acceptable. And in many ways you could argue that the model of the European Union was set up on the basis that officials knew better than voters what was good for them and the future direction of their countries. How do we turn this round, John? Can we turn it round?
Well, the only thing that the electorate can do is vote in politicians who are determined to implement their agenda and support them, because Trump's getting obviously hugely destabilised. There are forces attempting to destabilise. Well, the only thing that the electorate can do is ensure, for example, the upcoming elections which Trump's party is facing, is that they support them again.
Well, do you know what, John? I think all of what's happened in the last 2 weeks in America is all about the midterm elections, and we'll talk about those in the course of this hour. Jim says on Facebook, it's not the deep state, just people with different points of view. Jim, they're entitled to have different points of view, but if they're working for an elected US president who is carrying out the things he told the American people would do, surely their job in a democracy is to make sure he's able to do them, not to be the resistance against him carrying them out. That's how it seems to me. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 11:15. So Donald Trump is having a very tough time, and much of it is coming from his own staff and his own side, as somebody writes anonymously an article in the New York Times saying that there are people working within the White House trying to stop the president, resisting the president, doing the things he wants to do and doing the things he was elected on. Is he right to think there is perhaps a deep state at work? But the problems for Trump and the criticism for Trump is not just coming from within the White House. Actually, there is now an all-out attack against him. Why? Well, that's because there are some very crucial midterm elections coming up in November that could, if he loses them, lead not just to complete legislative deadlock on Capitol Hill, but actually talk that a whole impeachment process could be gone through. Now, we saw this, of course, with Clinton going back a few years, but if you get to that stage, it'd be very difficult for him as president to almost do anything. So it's a very big, crucial time. And former President Barack Obama. Now, he's surfaced and really put out now his most pointed critique to date of President Trump. On Friday, he spoke for over an hour before 1,000 students in Illinois. And it really is the first time since Trump became president that he's all out criticised him.
The status quo pushes back. Sometimes the backlash comes from people who are genuinely, if wrongly, fearful of change. More often it's manufactured by the powerful and the privileged, who want to keep us divided and keep us angry and keep us cynical, because that helps them maintain the status quo and keep their power and keep their privilege. And you happen to be coming of age during one of those moments. It did not start with Donald Trump. He is a symptom, not the cause. He's just capitalizing on resentments that politicians have been fanning for years. A fear and anger that's rooted in our past, but it's also born out of the enormous upheavals that have taken place in your brief lifetimes?
Well, the president, of course, did not take this lying down. He was on his way to North Dakota on Friday evening to give one of his big rallies, and this is what he had to say.
Somebody, a very popular guy here, was just interviewing me. You know who I'm talking about, great guy. And he said, what do you think of President Obama's speech? And I said, I'm sorry, I watched it, but I fell asleep. I found he's very good for sleeping.
Well, unusual really for Trump. Normally, you'd expect him to come back and punch hard in the ribs. But this time, actually, for once, laughing it off. I think Trump should do more of that sometimes, just laugh things off. But there is a big attempt to stop him putting in place his agenda. He's talked about dark forces. Many have said it's a paranoid conspiracy theory. But when John Sopel, the BBC's America correspondent, says today, actually, in this article, Trump's enemies are proving his conspiracy theories true, I wonder, is there a deep state at work in America, and is it at work in this country trying to thwart Brexit? Because I kind of think that it is. What does Nick from Croydon think? Good morning, Nick.
Hello, Nigel. Morning to you. The one thing about this that I found strange is what spy would write an article for the New York Times, indeed any newspaper, setting out I am a spy, which is effectively what the article in the New York Times says. That strikes me as very odd. And the only answer, the sensible answer I got to that, was that it's people within the deep state who I'm sure exist, talking to each other still. They've still not got over the fact that Trump won, Clinton lost. And this is them reassuring themselves that they are, after all, good guys rather than the election results showing the bad guys, the losers. I find that very strange.
I mean, the point of the article, Nick, is not for a spy to self-identify or to confirm their existence. The point of the article is to say the president is unstable, it's chaos within the White House, he's dangerous for the democratic values and economic well-being of America, and we're here resisting him. The point is they're basically saying, Nick, he's unfit to be president, aren't they?
Yes, but we've had now 3 or 4 different versions of this from 3 or 4 different people. There was a book by the staffer who had met him for 15 minutes or so in his lifetime, and he produced 300 pages based on that. There was the doctor who said he'd seen him on TV and said Trump was mad. I mean, there's just endless stories of these, and it's all variations on the same theme. You know, this bloke's a bad person. I don't like him. Therefore, you, the electorate, don't vote for him. And it's just this reassuring noises for the same people talking to themselves, for the rest of us.
But it's wrong, isn't it?
I think it's just so much smoke and noise.
Is it wrong, Nick? Is it wrong, or is this how it always is? I mean, we had a phone call earlier talking about Jim Hacker and the Yes Minister back in the 80s. Is it always like this, perhaps?
I think maybe it is. I feel sure that it is, in fact. But the only way you can deal with that is to put in control measures that ministers can give people a task, and those people are responsible for completing those tasks. And if they don't, there needs to be some kind of remedy for the ministers. You've not done what you've been asked to do. Therefore, you no longer stay in your post.
Yeah, well, a few sackings might be helpful. Nick, I thank you very much indeed for your call. President Trump, unfortunately, has been subjected to the condemnation of his administration from an anonymous source. It proves there are dark forces at work, says David. John Sopel takes a very similar view. It would not surprise me if there were dark forces out to get Trump, says BB. The biggest threat to our democracy is the civil service. They need to be drastically reformed, says Max in Cumbria. What is happening to Trump is happening to you and Brexit. There is an establishment trying everything to quash our democratic vote. If Brexit doesn't happen, as I said previously, democracy will be dead, says Peter. So far, a lot of you actually saying Sopel is right. They are out to get Trump. They are in many ways out to get Brexit. Please someone tell me that you think it's right they should be stopping the president doing things, that you think it's right that the Brexit process should be slowed down and diluted. 0345 6060 973. Do we need protecting from ourselves And if that's the case, maybe it is the job of a civil service to do it. Certainly, the founders of the European Union John Monnet firmly believed that democracy was a very inefficient process and there were better ways of handling these things. Claire is calling from Tottenham Court Road in central London. Good morning, Claire.
Yes, good morning. Well, I think that Donald Trump is wise to be wary of people with Machiavellian intent working against him, because thank God they are. They've realised just what the American people have voted for, and they're patriots who are trying to protect their country. Donald Trump's only concern is to dismantle every single benefit from the Obama era, whether it's to the benefit of the American people or not. I've got relatives in America, and they were terrified that the Affordable Health Care Bill would be abolished, because they've got members in their family who have got pre-existing health conditions, and they would be excluded from care, whereas at the moment they're covered forcibly by their insurers. But, Nigel, we've got the same thing going on in Britain, because the nearer Jeremy Corbyn gets to number 10, the more likely the Cayman Islands tax havens will go, the British Virgin Island tax havens will go. We'll get our railways and our utilities back. We'll get social services funded properly. We'll probably get the nursing bursaries back. But a lot of people do not want that, because a lot of people
are you saying the deep state would stop Corbyn?
They're trying, but fortunately, the British people see through it. They see through the invented anti-Semitism, the debacle, the so-called invented non-patriotism of this man's stance. And the Labour Party is now, as we were told by LBC, I don't know because I don't go into these things much, the Labour Party is now 4 points clear of the Tories. So therefore, you can do your best to bring down a good man, but if in Donald Trump's case it's necessary because he's working to the disbenefit of the American people.
But Claire, if he was elected, right? If he was elected to get rid of affordable health care, as you describe it, right? Obamacare, he would call it, and he was going to put in place, as he said...
Well, that's a pejorative, and you know full well...
But hang on, well, whichever way you argue it can be. But the point is, if he was elected to do it, is it right that bureaucrats and civil servants should try and stop him doing it?
But the fact is, Nigel, he didn't have anything to replace it with which was comparable or better. What he wanted to replace it with would exclude people with pre-existing conditions.
No, you're missing the point, Claire. The big point is, should our bureaucracies, our civil service, should they have the power to effectively undermine elected leaders?
If it's because they're saving... Look, you could say that in Roman times, they had no right to bring down Nero because he was the elected emperor. They had no right to bring down Julius Caesar, but he was turning the state into a dictatorship. Sometimes, Nigel, irrespective of what the electorate have been told or fooled into believing, if the people closest to Trump realise that what he's doing is insane, some of his measures are so extreme. I mean, they gave him the benefit of the doubt. They said some of it they agreed with, like, because they were going to benefit from tax.
So you think that actually it is correct and proper at times for administrations and civil services to temper what elected leaders are doing?
Nigel, stop being so naive, and this faux sanctimonious drivel is really annoying.
What are you talking about?
Stone, for heaven's sake, if they can see the country is going down a path which is detrimental, they have a patriotic duty to do something about it.
But if people have voted for it, what if people have voted for it?
But people, if you ask the general public, they probably vote to return capital punishment. But we've moved on from capital punishment.
If they want capital punishment, shouldn't they have it, Claire?
Capital punishment, oh, for heaven's sake, now we're slipping into the lunacy. Capital punishment
I wouldn't vote for it, Claire, but if actually in a democratic society that's what people wanted...
Don't you understand what these people are trying to do? It's got nothing against Donald Trump personally. Donald Trump is the worst thing to have ever happened to America. He's not fit to be a president. He doesn't have the intellect or the education to be a president.
4.1% growth. It's looking pretty good for many people in America, isn't it?
Again... Unemployment started going down in America from 2011. Yeah. All of this started under the Obama era.
And the lowest black unemployment in the history of the States. Claire, we can argue it all ways. You see him as a force for bad. Maybe there is an argument at times. That civil services should intervene. But I think democracy is what should actually come through, particularly if leaders are doing what they promised the electorate they would do. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 11:30, and American politics is never-ending drama at the moment. I guess with Donald Trump there, it was always going to be interesting, but when you get somebody from inside his own administration writing, saying they're stopping him from doing things, they're acting as the resistance, and then the witch hunt kicks off. And interestingly, one of the words that was used in the article was lodestar, and people found immediately, this is a word that Mike Pence, the Vice President, uses regularly. So all fingers point at the Vice President, and he has given a big interview to CBS and a very strong denial that he's acting in a Machiavellian way to bring down the President. Obama, for the first time really since Trump's been elected, comes and speaks out very strongly against him. What is going on, folks, and we're not talking about it in this country at all at the moment, but we will be, is that in about 60 days' time, there are going to be the mid-term elections in America. So let's have a little look at those. Let's find out what's happening and why those next 60 days are so crucial. Helping me with this is Dr. Tom Packer, specialist in American politics at the University of Durham. Tom, good morning to you.
Good morning, Nigel.
So please explain, because no one's heard this talked about anywhere, please explain to everybody what the midterms are.
The midterms are the elections for Congress, the US's equivalent of Parliament. The House of Representatives, which is half of Parliament, and a third of the Senate are up every 2 years. So they have elections every 2 years for Congress. And Congress is just as powerful as the president, if not much more so. And so it matters a great deal. If the Republicans lose Congress, Trump has much less ability to achieve anything.
Right, so the talk is, from what I've understood of this, that his majority in the Senate looks relatively safe, but it's the House of Representatives, it's rather like the House of Commons, where he could lose his majority. Is there any polling out there, Tom, at the moment to suggest that may well happen?
Yes, there's quite a fair amount of polling at the moment. The House of Representatives has over 400 members who are up every 2 years. So the big picture is what really matters for that. And the polling is showing the Democrats ahead by 8 or 9 points. Now, the lines are biased a bit in favour of the Republicans, but that almost certainly means a Republican majority. I would say, Democratic majority, sorry. I would say that's very, very likely. It would be, like, most estimates are the Republicans have about a fifth chance of holding the House. I think it's less. And I would disagree slightly on the Senate. I think most people, including me, would say the Republicans would probably keep it, but there is a real chance they could lose the Senate. Most of the Senate seats up are in very Republican areas of the country, but there are a few that aren't. So it's quite easy to imagine the Democrats just winning the Senate. Okay. But everything has to go right for them and wrong for the Republicans in the 6 or 7 close races that's going on.
But either way, if he does lose the House of Representatives, I mean, there is talk of this word impeachment, isn't there? That impeachment proceedings would begin. And again, this is a word that people read, they hear talked about, and nobody really understands. Tell us how the impeachment process works, please.
So it's actually taken from the British system. We just haven't used it for hundreds of years. The way it works is if a majority of the House of Representatives impeaches any office holder, including the president, which is what people are talking about this time, it then goes to the Senate, and 2/3 of the Senate have to vote to get rid of him. So if the Democrats win the House, if they decide Donald Trump is dodgy or whatever reason they want, they can impeach him quite easily, but they can't necessarily remove him from office. So lots of your listeners probably remember with President Clinton, he was impeached, but then only half the Senate voted to remove him, and you needed 2/3, so there was 16 votes short. So I think at the moment you'd need some very big new revelations coming out for enough Republicans to defect for 2/3 of the Senate to vote to get rid of him. That has to be more news.
Yeah, on current form, nothing like that is going to happen at all. But isn't it funny? I mean, they've built this system, Tom, with checks and balances, but haven't they almost guaranteed that every president finishes up for the last half of their presidency, effectively, in legislative terms, being a lame duck?
There's a lot in that. I mean, of course, the founding fathers, the people who created the US Constitution, wanted it to be hard to pass stuff, and they didn't believe in political parties, so they didn't quite realise how Congress and the president could polarise against each other. Having said that, if the president endorses policies on the other side of the political spectrum, so actually, if you look at the last 2 years of President Bush's presidency, quite a lot of left-wing policies like subsidising the banks passed, and that could well happen again, particularly if Donald Trump, who has a very interesting ideological history, ends up agreeing with the Democrats on some issues like trade or public spending. Now, I suspect it will all become a fight about whether he'll be impeached, and that will drown it out. But if President Trump backed the Democrats' agenda, that can make life very interesting.
Yeah, and just finally, Tom, what are the key states for us to watch over the course of these next 60 days?
In terms of the House, I think California and Illinois, there are big Republican majorities that look vulnerable. So California and New York, are particularly important. In terms of the Senate, I think key states to look at are North Dakota, where the Republicans might gain one, and Arizona, where the Democrats might. If the Democrats win both of those, they've got a good chance of winning the Senate. If they lose either one, the Republicans have kept the Senate.
Terrific. Thank you very much indeed. That was Tom Packer, specialist in American politics at the University of Durham, basically saying that where we are now, the odds are stacked against the president for these midterm elections. And that would mean if he loses control of the House of Representatives, basically getting any more significant legislation through for the last half of his term as president would be, I think, pretty close to impossible, is a reasonable way of putting it. And the chances of them launching an impeachment procedure against him pretty high, though it's unlikely, unless more revelations came out about Trump, for that to actually go anywhere, but it could just clog the whole system up. And this on the back, of course, of this all-out assault being launched on him, not just by Obama, but by people who work in his own administration. And I'm asking you, Trump has talked about the deep state. He's talked about people working against him. Many have thought it's absolute conspiracy theory. Greg on Facebook says, did paranoia get a mention? Yeah, Greg, a lot of people said that. But here today, John Sopel, the BBC's North American correspondent, and somebody who I think is viewed as being a very good journalist, the headline of his article, Trump's enemies are proving his conspiracy theories true. Maybe you think actually there are times when it is the job of the civil service to stop governments from doing things. My feeling is, if they've been elected on a ticket and a promise to the electorate, they should be allowed to carry it out. Not to do so undermines the democratic process. Lots of your messages coming in. Paul from Greenwich says, Nigel, I voted for Brexit because I feel it is wrong for unelected European politicians to make our rules and laws. It is also wrong that unelected civil servants are making our policies. Yes, Paul, and we could add, trying to slow down the whole Brexit process. Really good to hear wise words from a decent politician like Obama. Trump, by comparison, is a worm. I suspect he has few friends left. He will be gone soon. I don't think he'll be gone soon, Simon, at all. But he may, after November, be in a much more difficult position in Washington, D.C. Let's go to Joe, a new caller to the show from Edgware. Good morning, Joe.
Good morning, Nigel.
Right, so what do you make of the New York Times article and what his own staff are doing and saying about Trump?
Well, that's kind of my point. In the last sort of half an hour, whatever, you and some other callers have been saying it's the deep state working against him to frustrate his policies. It's the deep state working against Brexit to slow it down and go against the will of the people. It's not the deep state. The man who wrote, the person, I should say, who wrote the article himself said specifically, this is not someone from the deep state. This is someone from Trump's own administration who chances are he himself has appointed. Similarly, with Brexit in the UK, it's not the civil service, it's not some shady cabal of powerful men, interested in the status quo that are slowing down Brexit. It's the Prime Minister, and it's her appointed cabinet. And the reason that people like you and like Mr. Trump are pushing this narrative that there's some sort of conspiracy working against us, trying to frustrate the will of the people, is because when it all goes tits up, when the coal plants don't reopen in America, when we've got queues at Dover here, or we're stockpiling food and medicine, it's so you can have someone to blame.
Joe, I would make the point to you that Ollie Robbins is a civil servant. He clearly has won the power game going on for whose vision of Brexit was to win, and that directly has led to the resignation of Boris Johnson, David Davis and some other more junior
You think it was primarily
ministers.
Ollie Robbins and not Theresa May and her other Remainer
I think Theresa May chose their influence over the influence of David Davis, and I would guess
Theresa May, the democratically elected Prime Minister, made the decision, not a mysterious cabal of civil servants. Is that what you're saying?
I think Theresa May was pushed in that direction, yes, and I think it's very interesting if you look at what Theresa May said at the Lancaster House speech, and you then look, as we go on through the Florence speech and ultimately to the Chequers deal, you see a very, very big change in her position, and I think it's likely that that the influences of the officials who are with her and around her all day, and probably for half the night, given the hours that job is, have had a significant influence. Yeah, I do, actually, Joe, genuinely.
Was she under duress, or is she making these decisions herself based on how politics always works and has always worked?
Well, that's the point. Well, that is the point, Joe. And it may well be that actually this is just the way things have always worked. But there is a feeling. Did elected officials take advice from their self-appointed advisors? Well, who's in charge?
Is that what we're rallying against here?
I think what we're asking here is when voters vote for fundamental change, as they did in both the USA and the UK, is it not the job of the civil service to accept that that's the direction of travel for the duration of the term in terms of America, and a change of direction here? And I feel they're not doing that. What say you?
The job of the civil service is I mean, are we talking about the UK here or the United States?
Well, I think it was about both. I mean, primarily the United States, But, I mean, ultimately, advisors advise and ministers decide. That's the way it should be. That was the way Mrs. Thatcher ran her government.
That's the way it is.
Well,
the Prime Minister decides and advisors advise.
Well,
that's exactly what you've just said is happening.
Maybe the advisors have too much power. Joe, I've got to let you go, and a quick apology, folks, there. Joe did use a word we shouldn't be using at this time of the day. You're listening to the Sunday edition of the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. It's 11:46. And I think later on today, UKIP will be in the news because their NEC meets today to discuss a controversial motion as to whether their party conference should have a debate and a vote on whether Tommy Robinson should join the party. And this morning, Gerard Batten, UKIP's leader, has come out and praised the bravery of the former English Defence League leader. Now, it's interesting because the rules, and I sort of wrote them basically, are that UKIP bans people who are members of far-right groups from even joining the party, but Mr Batten is arguing that a special exception should be made. So I think there'll be a bit of talk about UKIP later on tonight and tomorrow. I think actually politically, UKIP could be in a very good place. There's a bigger and bigger and bigger gap opening up on Brexit amongst Labour voters and amongst Tory voters. And the NEC in their infinite wisdom will have to decide whether Tommy Robinson helps people focus on that or not. I won't attempt to influence it. I think I've said enough on this subject already, but it will be interesting. Now, on Twitter, I get, Nigel, you are an unelected, unrepresentative, you should stop trying to influence people. You could be seen as the deep state. Listen, matey, you could argue that every single commentator, every single journalist in the country was an unelected representative. And in case you hadn't noticed, I wish I wasn't really, but I am off to Strasbourg in the morning. We've got a really big week in Strasbourg coming up, including Viktor Orban, the Hungarian Prime Minister, is coming to address Parliament and no doubt get abused by Mr Verhofstadt. And we've got Mr Juncker's State of the Union debate. And I'm going to be in that European Parliament until we leave the European Union. And far from being unrepresentative, actually, do you know what? When I was elected last time, my party came top in the country, so don't give me that. Vicky is calling from Brighton. Vicky, good morning.
Hello, good morning, Nigel. Yes, I certainly think President Trump is being undermined from within. He's not one of the establishment, and people don't like the things he's doing, but he's running America as he sees correctly as a businessman and making it, more jobs, etc. But, with regards to this country, we shouldn't be surprised at all because Tony Blair, I think, went out of his way to politicise the civil service. And lots of commentators over the years have said this. And so basically, I feel very, very strongly about this. And I think that, you talk about dear Ollie. Well, when you look him up, he's never been in business. He's never done anything. He's just been a civil servant. And I think the whole of the establishment has got these people. And, of course, up and down the country, Blair made sure that people who thought like him got into major establishments like the BBC, etc., etc., etc. And this is undermining our whole...
I think you raise a very good point, Vicky. A very good point. It was said that Gladstone gave us the least corrupt, the most honest civil service in the world, and one that acted with political neutrality. And many observers, Vicky, would share your observation that Blair politicised it in many, many ways.
I think he did, yeah, absolutely. Just one other thing I'd like to say. Even at a local level, and over the years I've gone to council meetings, etc., sitting in the public gallery and all this kind of stuff. It is absolutely correct that local councillors should have to declare any interest that they have whether it's shareholdings or local companies or whatever, so that they are not biased and they have to stand away from making decisions. However, that does not apply to council officers, and I think it's completely and utterly wrong, because I've been to enough meetings in the public gallery and sat there and seen people nudge kind of stick your hand up now kind of effort.
Yeah.
And, you know, the officers have given a recommendation and whatever. Well, how do we know? You know, do we know they're not biased in some way from a personal point of view? Council officers and senior civil servants who are always protected should have to declare interests like shareholdings and companies and all the rest of it.
No,
should.
That's a fair point. Vicky, it's a fair point. The rule should apply both ways. I get that. Civil servants shouldn't advise. They should carry out the will of the electorate, if not leave. I get on Twitter. Well, no, they're allowed to advise. I just happen to think that their advice is just all-consuming, and in many ways it does. Maybe Mrs May's been influenced. I don't know. I'm a civil servant, and I voted out. I think Trump is great, says Dave from Dorset. OK, well, of course, there are some. Nigel, and I've done that one. One irrefutable fact: there has always been a shadow government. Presidents and prime ministers are mere puppets, with the real decisions taking place behind the scenes from unelected officials. Well, I think a lot of us feel that. It may well be that what is happening to Trump is actually not that exceptional. Maybe it happens all the time. Maybe the administration says, well, the president's got this bee in his bonnet at the moment, but you know what? If we shuffle those papers to the back of the pack, give him a real problem to look at, maybe by tomorrow he'll have forgotten about it. Maybe this is how government actually works. I just feel that the establishment, civil services of both countries don't like those big results of 2016 and want to do something to try and change it. And I don't like that. Annie is a new caller from Carnforth in Lancashire. Good morning, Annie.
Oh, good morning. Well, I feel it's quite a good thing if you've got civil service servants who have the courage on occasions to try and frustrate a leader from doing something completely insane. And I think Trump is quite a long way down the road to being an elected dictator. I'd put him on the same par, really, as Putin and Erdogan.
Hang on, Annie, how's he a dictator? I mean, you know, he is answerable for what he does. He'll be held democratically accountable. If he wants to get legislation through, he's got to put it through two houses on Capitol Hill. I mean, he hasn't got the powers of a dictator, has he?
Well, he can sign all those orders that he was so keen on being, filmed being signed in his office. You know, those orders where he can just basically, put things into motion himself and not have to go through either of the two houses. He's done quite a lot of that, actually, when he first got in. And he's done things like what dictators do, trying to make people believe that they can't believe anything the press says, any of the media, trying to make people believe that you can't trust the judiciary, all those kind of things. And if you look what's just been happening in Germany just recently with all those neo-Nazis on the street, they were shouting slogans, lying press, which is actually a Nazi was a Nazi slogan in the 1930s, and that's what Trump says, fake news all the time.
But I understand why he says fake news, but I genuinely do. I mean, actually, in many ways, the Democrats, Annie, are in such a mess in terms of their leadership in America that it's almost as if CNN and the New York Times have now become the opposition rather than objective press commentators. Annie, I mean, you may disagree totally with the Trump agenda and think it's dangerous, but has he done anything different to what he promised the electorate he would do?
Probably not, but on the other hand, some of the things he has I don't know whether he ever mentioned the Paris Climate Accord
endlessly
before. Well, if he did, fair enough, but that's still incredibly dangerous to the world. He's not just a danger to the American people, he's a danger to the world. So, I just think good on the people who are trying to frustrate him from doing anything too completely insane.
And Annie, what about the people who voted for him and want him to do these things?
Well, I mean, people voted for Hitler, didn't they?
Not with a majority, no. They did vote for Hitler in very significant numbers, and the German constitution collapsed. Annie, I thank you for your call. I thank all of you for your calls. One way of helping to ensure civil servants do not block the democratic will is to open up the civil service and politics and the media and the professions to normal working class people. Instead, we have a hereditary meritocracy. The upper middle class is only promoting the best from within their own class. Thus says Dominic in Banbury. be a lot more of Trump over the next 60 days as those midterms approach. You've been listening to the Nigel Farage Show here on LBC. I'll be back tomorrow evening at 6. At 3 this afternoon, it's Ian Payne. But up next, it's Majid Nawaz.
Thank you, Nigel.